What is the difference between a temperament and a personality, and how can you have both? This is Brian Lewis. I'm the human behavior theorist and founder of Temperament-personality, which is the modern temperament personality system. So I'll take a look back in history and look at some temperament systems, starting with Plato. So Socrates and Plato and Aristotle worked together a lot on personality theory, and not like rigid theories, but wrote expansive paragraphs about personalities. And Plato would always smash that like button right now to help me out with the YouTube algorithm. So Plato came up with four groups of people. He called artisans, guardians, idealists, and rationals. So you'll see those words still in my theory. That has lasted over 2,000 years and it's still really good. And so the Plato was talking about what different people contribute to society. So he said that artisans made normal kind of cool stuff for everybody, and then he said that guardians sort of protected the realm and provided security, and then idealists were sort of conceptualizing the spiritual morality of society, and then the rationals were discovering how nature works. So those are the four groups that Plato came up with, and then Aristotle went and added what makes each one of those groups happy. So he said that what makes artisans happy is the basic pleasures, and what makes the guardians happy is security, and what makes the idealists happy is some sort of spiritual fulfillment, and then what makes the rationals happy is knowledge. And so those are the four early temperaments. They weren't really called temperaments yet at that point, but the early four group kind of temperament theory. So when I say temperaments, I'm referring to theories that have 4 or 5 groups. Usually those are temperament theories where you have 4 or 5 distinctly different groups that you're looking at of behavior. And there's a whole lot of those theories in ancient times and modern times. There's lots of them. And they're all very similar. And when you get to a little bit AD, in Greece and Rome, you get to Hippocrates and Galen, and that's where the word temperament was really popularized. And they talked about dispositions, and they talked about, they were doctors, and they had the theory that there were fluids inside of your body that were causing your temperaments and your disposition. And those theories were really popular in medicine and personality for a really long time. And that's where the 4 boxes were really drawn around 4 different, personality groups that were the 4 temperaments, and the word temperament really stuck with those guys. And those aren't as a direct contributor to my theory as Plato. So I use Plato's words for those temperaments, and then switching over to personality. So personality is a more complicated combination of traits, and you get more personality types. So if you look at Carl Jung, he came up with the idea of like thinking versus feeling, and he had like introvert versus extrovert, and he had these ideas of like sensing versus intuition, and these different kind of traits. And he didn't come up with really different personality types, but he had sort of the archetypes of like which of these different traits are you doing more, and then Myers-Briggs picked that up, and Myers and Briggs did the Myers-Briggs personality types, which are those traits that Jung was talking about, thinking versus feeling, and the sensing versus intuition, and the introvert extrovert, and then they added the P and the J, which is judging and perceiving, and then you have that Myers-Briggs test where it's like, are you more a P or more of a J? And then you can kind of sort it down to a personality type, like one of the 16 personality types. So that's kind of a personality theory versus a temperament theory. And then David Keirsey. David Keirsey is my favorite. He's like the personality theory historian that went back and dragged up 2,000 plus years of personality history, and he mapped them all together and showed how they're related. And he took the 16 Myers-Briggs types, and he put each type inside of one of Plato's temperaments, and he said these Myers-Briggs types are artisans, and these Myers-Briggs types are idealists, and he lined them up where they all matched. And then he kept the idea that, like, the sensing versus intuition idea is sort of like the that idealist and rational are sort of connected. Like, those are the two conceptual intelligences, and they're kind of connected. And then the guardian and the artisan are kind of connected, and those are the sort of the physical intelligences. And then he did work on more physical behavior and how people use tools, and tried to make the theory more observable and more scientific. And he's great. So I read his work and I loved it, and I was like, this is so cool. This is the best theory I've ever seen on human behavior. And then I started thinking about it for months on end, like waking up in the middle of the night, like, oh man. So basically what I was realizing is that they're not really connected like that. Like, idealist and rational aren't really connected like that. And you can have idealist and artisan sort of combined in your personality, and there's different combinations. And then I kept working on it until I got to the point where you can have any of them in any order. And that was like the first version of my theory, was just to take those temperaments and just put them in a specific order for each person. And that was about 12 years ago that I like copyrighted the first version of that kind of idea of the theory. And that's before I really developed it and separated out the systems a little better. And still, like, the introvert extrovert idea that started with Jung was just kind of floating out to the side of the Myers-Briggs theory, and it's just kind of floating out to the side of Keirsey's theory, and it never really got addressed as to what that is. So in Keirsey's theory, he's talking about like social intelligence systems and observable behavior, and then introvert extrovert's like not a system or really addressed, but it is observable. But what is it? I don't know. So that was a big challenge, was to identify what that is. And so I have a social intelligence system called extrian in my theory. So I have artisans, guardians, extrians, idealists, and rationals. There's 5 social intelligence systems that everybody uses, and they can come in a specific order for each person. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order for each person. And you use the first one all the time, and the farther down you go, you use them less. And it's not just like percentage-wise less, like the top one governs the one under it, and those 2 govern the one under it, and those 3 govern the one under it. So like the last one only operates if it agrees with all the ones above it. So there's a functional order of those systems, and that is the current version of my theory, where you have the temperaments combined in an order to create the personality. So that is a temperament-personality system, and it's pretty simple. So if you just combine those 5 things, there's 120 different orders that you can put the 5 temperaments in, and then you get 120 personality types, and that's it. You just have 120 personality types. So I'm making a 1-question test that just puts those in order, and you hit go, and it's like, okay, that's this personality. And pretty simple. Like, you could definitely cheat on the test as soon as you understand the system. But for somebody that doesn't understand it, hopefully they'll pick the right ones and get a good answer. So that's temperament versus personality, and the combined like temperament personality system, where you have them all defined and ordered for each person. And that's a pattern that lasts for your whole life. Like, I think you can identify that definitely around age 2, but around age 1, you can already identify it. So I don't know when it becomes sort of solidified, but that's your personality for life. And there's certain percentages of different personalities, which is really interesting. So like artisans are by far the highest percentage of all the personalities. And it's also an evolutionary theory. Like, artisan evolves first, and there's just more of them. And that gets complicated when you start talking about reproduction and where does the type come from and that sort of thing. It gets really complicated. But I don't know. I just know the percentages and I know the social intelligence, and I don't know where it where it originates and why the percentages are like that. But it's like that everywhere in the world. And just reading back to Plato and Aristotle and everything, it sounds like it's been like that the whole time. So pretty interesting. And that is temperament personality. Cheers.